you would say the shit that I would sit there and be like, I can't believe he just said that, kind of thing. And I was the more calm, kind of like logical, like, okay, let's talk, like, let's just be very pragmatic here.
What is going on, Our Future Podcast viewers? This is Michael Sikand. I am joined by my co-host and co-founder, Simran Sandhu. And for the past roughly 50 episodes of this show, we've been covering the most successful and ambitious young people building companies that are going to change the world. And we analyze them from our perspective and give you their strategies and insights so you can use them to inform your own business building endeavors. But today, we're mixing things up a little bit. Simmy and I haven't really done an episode where we've talked about what we've done. And some of you guys are probably new to the content. You got thrown our stuff on the algorithm, and we'd love to introduce ourselves and just tell you some of the lessons that we learned when scaling and building our media company and getting an acquisition within only a couple of years of starting it to a major media company with Morning Brew. So Simmy and I are scrappy. We've been in the trenches. We have an interesting history together. We knew each other long before we even started a business. And we've had a bit of a ride. So we've been at our acquiring company for about a year and a half now. But there's still tons of lessons and insights that we think back on all the time and that, you know, we went through that I think you guys can learn from. So here we are, mixing things up with a fresh new take on Our Future Podcast episode.
Yeah, and I think the biggest secret we're going to divulge here is that our first company together was not actually going to be Our Future. It was supposed to be a D2C beverage company called Jet, but more about that later.
Dude, Jet Coffee could still be absolutely massive.
We definitely got to touch on it in the show. Like, someone should definitely listen to this and go run with it. I bet that could be a 7-figure, maybe even 8-figure D2C brand in the next few years for sure.
Yeah, but what we've learned, right, is to like, in that kind of market, like distribution, retail, like you got to either get like a big dog on board who's been in the industry for like 30, 40 years, or bring on like a celebrity, like a Jake Paul or something, you know what I'm saying? So I feel like if anything that we've learned, Simmy, it's like whatever opportunity we go after next, we need to have the right people backing us. And that's really hard when you're a first-time entrepreneur, but that's kind of what we afforded ourselves with like getting an acquisition done early on in our career. You know, we did sell early. We probably could have made more money had we continued to run the business ourselves. But we really were thinking about like the big picture. Like building a media is really hard. You know, for those who haven't started a media company, you can't really raise outside capital. The venture returns aren't there. And if you are going to put money in, it's got to be your own. And we didn't have any money. So we were in an interesting situation, but we still found ways to grow and scale. And, you know, we really looked at how do we turn our future into a way bigger opportunity in the future, quite literally. And that's what we've done. So we've kind of positioned ourselves well, built a big network and have a name for ourselves. So that was a strategy in many ways, you know?
Totally. And I think when we started out, we were just two young guys. We didn't have much money. We were still in college. And so I think a lot of what we were trying to do at that time was how do we give ourselves some cheat codes so we can win in the future? And it just felt like podcasts were the easiest way to do something like that. It was one of those things where, hey, we really want to talk and network with really important people and, you know, get our names out there. It's COVID, so why the hell not? Right. And it was like one of those interesting things where, you know, we were both able to do some cool stuff with our podcast. You were interviewing big C-suite executives. I was doing a daily news podcast, and that is something I would say has proved to be one of the most highest leverage activities you and I have both done up to this point. We still use the connections that we made from those shows several years later. And now we're in a much better spot to add value to those people that we were talking to. I think, you know, when we were doing our podcast, it was a little intimidating at the time because these are very important people. And it's like, man, what can a 19, 20-year-old like give them? Like, what is the value? And what I learned was that when you can give people a platform, it can be a tremendous opportunity for yourself, and more people are way more likely to do it. I think older people are just, they want to help younger people out. And so that was a big unlock for me mentally at that time, was like, man, like I may not have a whole lot of value to add, but it's okay. They know what they're getting into. And, you know, a lot of people have kind of the similar questions when you're doing a podcast or an interview of any kind. And so if they find an opportunity like through a pod where they can talk to a lot of young people all at once, it actually is better for them, right? So it's kind of those like force multipliers, if you will, is just like starting a podcast or doing something where you can build your network early on.
Dude, the biggest thing I learned, right? Like honestly, starting a podcast or like doing a podcast as a young kid and interviewing big CEOs and entrepreneurs, that feels like a very like kind of overused play now. I feel like a few
Yeah.
years after kind of I feel like we were pretty early to it, but I still think there's tremendous opportunity because there are kids who go and do it, but they don't do it that well. I've seen a lot of kids go out and try it, but they don't put their heart and soul into it. They don't brand their show correctly. They don't distribute their show correctly, and they don't build the right intangibles around it. So what really made when I decided to start a podcast, it was COVID. I was 20 years old, and it was like, I'm going to go and reach out to these people because I'm going to seize this moment of COVID. They're probably using their computer more. Their Zoom is now a thing. That's really what enabled the opportunity is to do this remote podcast. And I would just paint our future, the podcast as around so many intangibles, right? Like I would say this is the business podcast for young people. I would, kind of take numbers from across social channels to display the total audience size. And that's not as many listeners as they actually have on the podcast. And I would open with, these subject lines being like, the number one show for Gen Z or stuff like that. And people were receptive to it. And it's really just about the tact and the strategy you bring to it. So I still think there's tremendous potential if you're a young person to go out and try what we did, even if it doesn't become a business. It's just going to open a ton of doors for you. I mean, I was offered so many internships during those conversations when people can just see your hustle. Like you're here, sitting next to someone who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars or running a huge company, and it's like if you're having this conversation with me right now, you're probably made of something more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would say we had different approaches on how we thought about it. I think yours was just an interesting, passion driven type of opportunity around the podcast. It was just like, man, I really want to talk to these people. I think what the way I looked at it was a little bit more opportunistically, which was, hey, I love what those guys out of Michigan did with Morning Brew. I think newsletters are a really saturated space. No one is doing this in podcasting. So let me see if I can try to replicate it. And we had
Yeah.
a very similar outcome in that we had exposure to really, really cool people and we learned a lot through that process. But it was like one of those funny things where by going into like I would say by just getting started somewhere, like we are in a very very different place. Like what our future was as a media company in 2020 versus where our future as a media company is in 2024 are like two totally different places.
Yeah.
And funny enough, we've come full house in that we're both back on a podcast, and it just so happens that we're doing it together this time.
Dude, it's all about like just doing something that you can like work on every day. I think for me, like I wasn't technical and I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And media is an amazing place to start because you don't need technical skills or a co-founder to get into it. Anybody can use some of these video editing platforms, tools, Riverside, like we're on right now, right? To like do a show like this, use email. Like these are all technologies that were created a long time ago that anybody can leverage super easy. So I think that's a big part. But I also just want to talk about like how you and I were really close friends, I would say, like just on the phone remotely, because like we connected over our shared interest in podcasting and we ended up being co-founders in the future. And I just want to say, if you're struggling to find a co-founder with whatever enterprise you're working on and you need one, think about just like networking with other kids who have a similar idea and who are building in the same space, but still feel like they want to do it themselves. And don't make it transactional, right? Just like build relationships and create friendships with other entrepreneurs because we did end up coming together and joining forces once we figured out a little bit more of the direction of something that we could both agree on could be huge. So I think that's a good piece of advice for young people is like, find other kids who are interested in the same thing. And maybe you don't work together from the start, but build that relationship over time. And maybe you guys could join forces down the line.
I think we were friends for almost 2 years before we actually
Mhm.
started to get into business together. And I think that was tremendously helpful, not only from a standpoint of developing the relationship, but also just getting a good understanding of how you thought about things and also where my strengths and weaknesses are. Right. By the time we actually decided to work on our future together, I had a pretty good sense of where I fit into the puzzle and where I think I could add the most value. And so I think that's something that you can only do with enough time at your back. Now, I will also say is that, before you get into any kind of business, you want to think hard, right? About like what is your intended goal at the end of this. I'm not so big on the just like wander aimlessly approach. I think that can work, but like I think there is an intended goal that you have to have in mind. Now, how you get there will change. And it's not uncommon for folks to pivot. That even happened with the both of us, right? We were both in podcasting first, and then we ended up in short form, right? Because there was an opportunity that, presented itself. But I think that that's really, really important, right? Because you don't want to be so rigid in that you're stuck on a fixed plan, because I think sometimes when the plan doesn't work out, you're not making any movement or progress, and sometimes it's in your own benefit to move on to the more higher leverage opportunity. But I think both you and I were from day one dead set on, hey, we want to go build a big media company, and we both had very big ambitions on the work we were doing.
Yeah, and we made it so like, everything was on the table, right? We were just like super scrappy. So, in like the earliest days, right? Like uh the ad deals started like really small, right? Like when we had, we built up this short form video presence and had a few tens of thousands of followers. Then it just came down to in the creator world, like the content world, right? Like it's really just like how you pitch yourself. Obviously, there's like a cap to like the actual dollar amount you can charge for some of these videos on short form at that time. But it was all about like we always pitched our future as being like the next best thing since sliced bread. Like we're going out. The way we cover companies is different from anybody else in the market, and we still stick to that principle in pitching people for ads, which is nobody has the storytelling capability that we do. Nobody does it like us. And as a content creator, like you can really like create that intangible and that like you own the specific audience, you do things in a different way than everybody else. And I think that's a lot of other businesses can't say that. A lot of other businesses have direct competitors. As a content creator, you can essentially in media, like you can essentially you can make it seem like there's a vacuum of competition because you're doing something in a very particular way. So I think that's just like another cheat code. Again, I think a lot of what we went through, Simmy, is like we just pitched ourselves in a really big and ambitious way. And I think that's just a huge takeaway because when you're young and you don't have any backing and you don't have any status or credibility, you need to be somewhat delusional and you need to be able to pitch yourself in a really big way. And you need to just tell people what's up because that's how they're going to take you seriously. And there's a
I
limit to
100%,
like
yeah,
delusion,
100%
but
agree.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think, take that a step further. I would say that, when you're young and you're building your first company, it's not, one of those things where you have to reinvent the wheel. Truly find any, working model or find inspiration from something that already works. I don't know, if we've talked too much about this in the past, but Michael, I know that like even with some of the short form video stuff in the beginning, a lot of the inspiration for this came from what was working on TikTok, but in a totally different space. Right. And
yeah,
it was like one of those things where you were able to connect the dots, which was, hey, no one is doing this specifically for business content. Right. And so at the end of the day, it was like, hey, if this is engaging in, I don't know, finance, healthcare, sports, whatever it looks like, this would also be really, really engaging in business. And here's why I believe that would be the case. And so find
exactly.
inspiration, and it's better that you find an existing model that works rather than trying to recreate the wheel, is kind of been my experience as well.
There's a lot more risk to trying to reinvent the wheel, right? There's a lot more uncertainties. If you can find a
Yeah,
corollary for your business, that's the most important part. So just find a model that works and then apply your particular passion or interest to, whatever that is. Um, so I think that's just like a good tenet, right? Of that's what all the great business leaders did. Like I remember reading Sam Walton's book, like right around that same time that I found this other format that was working on TikTok and applied it. What he would do is he would just go into all these other department stores and all these other retailers, and he would just study what worked, and he would just combine the best parts into building his vision for what Walmart was. So really, like that's why biographies exist, right? Like you just learn from other entrepreneurs, and you take kind of the things that work for them and apply them to your own model on a slightly differentiated way. And there's plenty of space for that. There always is, just to do something a little different.
totally. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. So yeah, I think inspiration was important. I agree with your point about delusion. I also think you have to lean into FOMO as much as you possibly can, right? So one part of believing that you're building the next big thing that the world needs to see and experience and consume is making it so very few people have access to it, right? And so when we would go pitch advertisers, right, we would bring in this pitch around, we are the brand safe destination to reach Gen Z. And we're only taking 3 big advertisers in this quarter, to do ad deals with. And obviously that wasn't true, right? We would have taken anyone who was willing to sign a check. But it was one of those
Yeah.
things where it's like, wait, like, okay, one, they say they're really big, and I do think their style is unique. And wait, like, maybe this is like really in demand. And like maybe I'm hurting myself by not working with them, or maybe I should at least give it a chance. And so I think, you have to be really smart around this as well. And I think that also applies to fundraising too.
Yeah.
Michael and I both went down the fundraising path, and we ended up not doing it. Thank God. It would have been a really, really bad business decision. But, I think the one liner you would use in all of the closing emails was like, I got one spot left in this round. Let me know if you're in. And
Yeah.
if
It
not, like,
worked pretty
cool.
well.
Yeah, it worked really well, but like it wasn't like one of those things where you were begging, right? I think anytime it almost feels like you're super desperate, like it actually turns a lot of people off. And so you want to lean into the FOMO, you want to lean into the exclusivity, and you want to lean into, hey, we are way bigger than what it may seem like on the surface.
Dude, I mean, FOMO is just like everybody's brain works in that same scientific way, right? So I think that's a great tenet that you could apply to anything, whether it's like selling, pre-selling, fundraising. All of that is on the table. When we'd reach out, we started reaching out to a bunch of VCs and CEOs at big media companies, and so many of them responded
And these were
because
people
just
that you had interviewed on the podcast to bring it full
well,
circle. Like this was the
some of them,
existing network.
I think
Yeah.
some of them, yeah, I would reach out to, but also there was plenty of cold emails that we sent out to the CEOs of some of the biggest media companies in America, right? And they responded to this pitch because it was irresistible, right? It was like we've found this new format in TikTok, this new social channel, and it's the next way, it's the next platform for building, the next Vox or Vice or CNN, right? And that it was like this moment in time where even like the older people in the room were starting to hear rumors about TikTok and the hot new platform. And we were those two kids who were experimenting with it and bringing it to the big dogs, right? So being able to take, what the young people are all talking about and the new hot buzzy thing and present that to someone and say like, we are the guys who are going to go do it, really commanded a lot of attention to these pitches. And, we ended up getting into meetings with a lot of these folks, right? And then, it's kind of like that's when kind of conversation started to change that like maybe we could actually, end up selling this business pretty quick, right? And get ourselves that stamp of approval so we could do something different in the future that we felt, was more scalable and like a better business model than media because we really started to see the constraints. I want to say about winter 2023, we really started to see the constraints of what we were doing, right? Like we couldn't hire enough. We didn't have the cash flow to hire enough like content creators and the time to go out and build organic audiences from scratch. So we were like, okay, if we can't scale the advertising side to our business, we need to find something new. And that's when getting the My First Million deal became a tenet of our business, a pillar, right? Of let's build a services business where we take our expertise in the business world and short form video and apply that to companies that have an interest in that. And the story goes is that Sam and Sean on the My First Million podcast, we've modeled our show a lot on what they've done, but they were looking for somebody to take them viral on TikTok because it was like that hot channel that they didn't know about and they needed a young killer to go do it. I mean, who better equipped than us? So ended up winning that competition, just pure meritocracy. We won it. And ended up parlaying that into our deal with HubSpot, which is now one of our biggest clients, continuing to be across all their short form video for their podcast networks. And then that opened the door to all these other
Yeah.
B2B software companies we now work with today. I mean, it's countless. So for anyone who doesn't know, right, like our future is in many ways a media company that's disguised as an agency. We found an alternative revenue source and we're able to use an unfair advantage in being a massive media company and connecting those two. And I think that's a way that a lot of media companies end up making money is through like a kind of services business side.
Totally. I think we really benefited ourselves by staying open to the business model itself. We weren't really, fixated on this has to be an advertising driven business model only. And so when that opportunity presented itself, we actually found ourselves in a much better spot. And so, it actually has left me with a very long lasting impression, which is a lot of business success is driven around creativity, around the business model itself. And so,
Yeah.
in again, like surface value, it's like, okay, you got services, you got ads, like what's so unique about that? But like when we sold, that was a really, really big deal. There wasn't, this hybrid agency slash media company of sorts that was
No,
doing the things we were doing at that time. And
completely
it was
novel for
really
sure.
unique, and it made us really, really appealing, especially to a lot of the people we were trying to talk to around like potentially selling or have them invest in the
Yeah,
business.
because
Yeah.
we solved for the challenges in advertising businesses, right? Which is, you can have a do 50 grand 1 month and then $0 the next month just because of how the ad market works. So we were able to
Yeah.
build repeatable recurring revenue, right? Which is really what enabled our business to be able to stand on its own. And for you and I to go and pay ourselves salaries and for us to have cash flows to hire and grow and expand, right? So it was those two sides of the business, me leading the media side, you leading the agency side, that really enabled our future to become a multifaceted business that was much more appealing to an acquirer, right? Because we had stable recurring revenues. And that's why I just think media companies are so hard to sell, right? Because the business model is inconsistent when it's just advertising focused. And the biggest thing I learned, dude,
Yeah.
is just like ads are not a meritocracy. It's like years of relationship building, brand building to be able to secure these placements. You know what I mean? It's just not a meritocracy. I mean, you can't just apply because you have this many views and just get the equivalent ad dollars.
Recurring revenue is such a beautiful thing. And I
Yeah.
think, especially in 2024, it feels like everybody has woken up to this and everyone's trying to build some services arbitrage. But it was kind of the value of being early to a specific, um, area or opportunity, I would say. Like at the time, no one was thinking about services kind of in this way, which was, hey, we have a working format here. If we license this out to other big companies who have very deep pockets, that could be really, really interesting. And we did it in kind of a creative way, because I think a big factor in those conversations at the time is like, hey, if we give, this editing prowess or, our editors to these big companies, does it dilute our brand? And the answer being it was no, because we were very strategic on what we were licensing. We
Right.
weren't giving them the playbook. We would come up with something really bespoke and unique for them. And
Yeah.
so it actually made us somewhat defensible, because I think if we had gone into every single company with the same cookie cutter strategy, it would have been way easier to replace us and, find some other agency who could undercut us in price, and then they would be working with them instead. But it was like, no, every single offer is so unique. Now, granted, that does present scalability challenges of its own if you don't have something that is kind of like very templatized. But I would also say that for where we were at in our business at that time, it was really a moat for us. Something else that I thought was really cool was just when you would go into these meetings, we had a very different dynamic. And I think, we played this like good cop, bad cop strategy, although I don't know if it was intentional per se. It was just like having very different personalities, which was you were the more bold one out of the two of us, and you would say the shit that I would sit there and be like, I can't believe he just said that, kind of thing. And I was the more calm, kind of like logical, like, okay, let's talk, like, let's just be very pragmatic here. And I actually think that really helped us with investor conversations and acquisition conversations, because I think this is a good segue into how the Morning Brew opportunity came about. And so, Austin, Alex, both of those guys had gone to Michigan, and Michael had as well. And, we had this opportunity to go to Austin and try to persuade him to invest and lead in our round. And Michael, tell me if I'm wrong, but the conversation was essentially like, hey, we're trying to build, the Barstool business. We're going to crush. We're already doing so well. Would you want to lead our round? And Austin saying, hey, this is interesting, but I would rather buy you guys. And it was the confidence in, maybe even the delusion that you're referring to, where you were essentially just like, no, I'm not going to sell. And I think it was one of those like defining moments. By saying no, we're not looking for a way out, they only wanted to buy us more. And so I think, same thing about the FOMO thing. When an opportunity does present itself, don't just act like you've been there before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like someone raises a small round and it's like, oh my gosh, you think they would have
Yeah.
taken the company public by the way they're like, going crazy about this. And it's like, no.
You just have to own it. You really have to have that confidence. And like, you can't let anybody get the hint that you don't. I also want to talk about though, like it did take us a long time to close the deal with Morning Brew, from while we were still building our business. And I just think like the build to acquisition strategy is like really unpredictable, because once you have acquirers talking to you, like it can pollute your mind so that you stop growing your business and you're just focused on getting that deal done. But like deals don't go through, like, they fall through. Most deals fall through. So, it's just, it can poison and pollute. And I think you and I, we did actually lose a little steam on like our vision and our mission while we were having those talks. So, I would just advise, when anybody ever comes to me and they're like, somebody just mentioned like they might want to buy my business, I'm just like, brush it off, man. Like it's probably not true. But see it through. I mean, try your best, but like, don't let it get to your head. And I think that's one of the big lessons from what we did is just not getting caught up in that idea of like, oh, soon enough we're gonna have our business sold. It's like it's gonna take time. The odds of it closing are very low. So just continuing to build your business and do your thing, I think, is like the most important part.
Yeah, I think we definitely did try to preserve optionality as much as we can. And that was ultimately the reason why we chose not to go the fundraising route, which was, hey, we don't want anyone telling us what we need to do and be stuck on these arbitrary deadlines of sorts. We want to build the business we think makes the most sense. And I think going back to the acquisition thing, it was one of those things as well. Like we never shut the door on any of the conversations. We were actually entertaining, multiple offers and opportunities all at the same time. We never necessarily told anybody to kick rocks, but we weren't begging for an offer either. And so I think that was one of those things where, we didn't really know what we wanted out of them per se, but we were just like trying to get the highest bidder, and we were like trying to get them to make the next step. And, we were a little bit in our heads too much as well. We were like, wait, should we send this email? Should we follow up
Yeah.
now? Like, what would like the bold person do in this play, but like also still be respectful and like not piss them off too much and not feel like we're super anxious about it. And I
Dude,
think
I
like going
think,
back, yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
I just want to mention like the importance of getting to the decision maker. A lot of deals are caught
Totally.
up with a
That's what I was about to
middleman
say.
between the
Yeah.
decision maker, like, and you guys. And we got caught up in a lot of conversations with the middleman. And I think, the best way to see if a deal is going to happen is to look at the decision maker's eyes, think if they really want to do this or not. And if the decision maker doesn't follow up with you and isn't being receptive, like they probably don't want to do the deal. So I think that's just a great principle. Like, make sure that you're talking to the decision maker when it comes to actually, getting bought or getting an investment or whatever. Don't get caught with some analyst or middleman. And, just understand that, the decision maker is the one you need to analyze and observe and to really figure out if this deal is going to go through.
I totally agree. And I think the way to do that is by just having the discussion very early on, which is, hey, who all needs to be involved when approving this deal or saying rejecting it? Like you need to figure out who the key people are very early on in that discussion. Because like if you get stuck behind the person who doesn't really have authority and they may have their own, incentives or agenda that they're driving, it can be a really, really tough spot to try to navigate. Because like then you can't go over their head, and that can kill the whole entire thing. And so you just have to be really, really careful. I would also say don't leave anything up for assumption. When you do decide to go down that path of trying to get your company sold, right? Even though it may make strategic sense for the company that is buying yours to do what you think they should, make sure you verify that they will do those things. Like get it in writing before you actually sign the dotted line. Like it may be one of those things where it just feels uncomfortable because it's like, man, this should really feel intuitive and this just makes a lot of sense. But like you
Yeah.
don't want to be in a spot after the deal happens where you're like, man, I really like feel like, I don't know, you get cheated here because it's like this thing that I wanted to have happen didn't happen. So make sure like have those uncomfortable discussions up front. I would probably even say like, you kind of want to save your time. Like if a deal isn't going to happen, you might as well like try to crush the deal as quick as you possibly can. Ask those tough
Yeah.
questions. Do your due diligence and like be bold in the very very beginning so that like all of the follow-up discussions are just on the one or two things that are really really important, right? Because if you think about these like deals just more broadly speaking, there may be 20 points, but 18 of those points do not really matter. It's one or two points that like are really really critical for both sides in the party. Figure those out as quickly as you possibly can, and make a decision, right? You don't want to compromise there, and then you just have to be really 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 strategic, right? So in this scenario, if you have 20 points that you're negotiating on, don't just give up all 18 in the very first meeting or two meetings and just say like, yeah, that doesn't really really matter to me. Yeah, I'm willing to negotiate there. Like you still want to play hardball a little bit, right? So be
Yeah.
strategic on what you're willing to negotiate on, but deep down know that these are two things that like are absolute non-starters. You're not going to move there. They are deal critical factors.
Yeah, I think those few critical points are really important, right? Like the money is the money and the deal is the deal, but like what happens after and like what happens with your business after is super important. I remember we were very intent on like we are going to be doing a podcast with the Morning Brew no matter what happens here. And like we made that very clear that that's what we needed if we were going to go do this. And they ended up giving it to us, right? So that I think things like that are like key, right? Like and it's been awesome. Like we've got to meet so many people, and not like this show's huge at all. But it just we've gotten to meet so many people. We've gotten deals through this. Like it makes us more relevant. So like just getting those like cherries on the top of the sundae when it comes to the deal, I think is really important if they're really like non-negotiables to you. And for us, getting acquired
Yeah.
by Morning Brew was in many ways a way to expand our personal brands and expand our platforms, like personally. So that's exactly why we're able to go and do this, and we're really grateful we were able to get that through. Um,
I would
so
also
you have
say
to
that
think
when we were
about
talking to potential acquirers, it was one of those things where they were very hyper personalized pitches and conversations. So we would do the prep work beforehand to say, hey, this is how we will fit into your organization. And this is a key problem that you're facing. And here is exactly how we solve this for you. I think if you can remove that step and show your value in like the first 5 minutes of your call, they know you're very serious characters, and it's like they're excited to take the conversation forward because it's not one of those like, oh, these are just two young guys looking to make a lot of money. It's like, no, they've deeply tried to understand our business, and they're trying to add value. It's a kind of a very value add mindset to have, and I think that especially with the enterprise companies we were talking to didn't end up doing a deal with, like I could notice a day and night difference versus when we would bring up those details versus like just having a more just like informal conversation and like you're just shooting the shit and trying to get to know each other, but you're not really making progress.
again, like I think there were some big parts to this, which are, find someone with complementary skill set and interest in the same industry. Find the new medium, the new arena that like is making sense for the space and that everyone's kind of looking at. Create intangibles, be able to pitch yourself bigger than anybody else, right? Bring that pitch to the right people, and think really intentionally about the acquisition process and think mainly that it's not going to happen.
I think I got a few other things that just came to mind, and we can do this almost rapid fire like. So, give me your take on these. But one, I think around the topic of competition, yes, be aware of your competitors and know what they're doing that is unique, but do not like change your strategy based on what a competitor is doing. And I think this is something that like was a great lesson to have early on, but like also did hurt us a lot, which was like we were hyper focused at like what the competing agencies and competing short form media companies in the business space were doing. When I now look at it, like look at the space 3 years later, most of them do not exist. And it's like one of those funny things where it's like, at the end of the day, one or two will remain, the rest will fizzle out. So I'm curious to get your take on it.
Yeah, I think you have to dance to your own drum. You know what I mean? I think we always were doing something a bit unique, but yeah, I mean, we were just, I think like it's just my advice is just pretend competition doesn't exist. Pitch yourself like competition doesn't exist. Be the only person doing what you're doing, because you're describing it like that. There might be other people who are kind of doing something similar, but like you are the only person who's doing this, and believe that deep down. I think that's like the biggest piece of advice I can give, is just to believe it. Even if there are competitors, just believe you're the only one, and bring that energy and
Totally.
confidence to other people. Yeah.
100%. And I think
Okay.
when you are pitching yourself and you find a really unique framing or unique positioning, what's great about it is you get to create the rules, right? And so we were saying we were
Right.
the only brand safe destination for, advertisers to reach, the business Gen Z audience. And what that meant is really we could command our own prices, right? And so we just kept raising our prices until we heard no, until it got to the point where it's like, okay, we are consistently hearing no because the pricing is too high. We just kept going up and up and up. And so I think that is kind of the value in finding unique positioning, is like you get to define the rules. And I think even more broadly speaking, even if you are in a more commoditized industry or there's a lot of businesses doing what you're doing, use other businesses. And I know this kind of, it feels a little counterintuitive to the competition aspect, but figure out what the incumbents are charging, and use that as a benchmark for your own pricing, because I think that is one of the hardest things for people, young people especially, to nail early on, is like, how much do we sell this for, and like what all are they going to get. So I think use what exists and then try to find your own tweak, or find your own flair so you can create your own rules. And the last thing I would say is be very careful of whose advice you take. And this feels like, again, one of those things where you don't want it to deter your strategy, right? You know your business better than other people do. And man, there were like 20 different occasions I can think of where we were almost about to do the wrong thing because some very successful person or some very like creative person told us we should be doing it.
Bro, it's crazy. Like Bobby Axelrod has that line. It's like, when you're rich, like you're kind of like when you walk into a room, you know what everyone wants. I think it's also like as a startup founder with a good idea and a little bit of traction, you're also a hot commodity to others to puppeteer, right? Like we had people being like, yo, you guys need to go raise hundreds of millions. We're going to take you public on the Canadian Stock Exchange. We had people being like, you guys should just stay bootstrapped and continue to do this and like build out kind of like a Barstool model with like fractional ownership. I nearly turned our future into a crypto business media company because I was looking at the NFT space and how much money was to be made there. Imagine where we would have been right after the crash happened in the summer before we ended up selling. So, damn, there's a lot. They're going to pull you in every single direction, especially if you got a little bit of success. They're going to want to, kind of remote control you and do what benefits them, which in many ways is like them getting to invest and then them bringing the strategy out, or them getting to work with you in some capacity, right? So everybody's playing their own agenda. Nobody's giving you advice as an entrepreneur and out of your self good, right? Like there are mentors you can have like that, and people have those mentors. We have those mentors, but there are people who are on the outskirts that are looking in the inside and figuring out what they can make of the situation that you are in the driver's seat of, and they're going to want to be your passenger, showing you the map of where you need to go. And you want to set your own navigation address. You want to use Apple Maps yourself. You don't want anyone setting that for you.
So true, man. I mean, you got to figure out like what their incentives are, because it's like one of those things where, to your point, they have their own personalized agendas, but also like, you know, it's kind of like the whole hammer and nail thing, which is if you're talking to venture backed people, they're going to encourage you to go raise money. That's what they know. If you're talking to bootstrap people, they're going to tell you to bootstrap. That's what they know. If you're talking to, some other business mix, right? Like they're just going to tell you what to do based on their own experiences. And honestly, like this is where talking to like maybe really, really successful people who built and sold companies, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, isn't so helpful, because the business conditions and the business environment is so, so different, right? If you're trying to build a big services business now, you would have to use an entirely different playbook versus like the 2010s. And so
Yeah.
just be careful about like who is giving you this advice, what their experience was themselves, and like what the general, business conditions are, because what worked for them at that point is not going to work for you in, the current timing and the current business that you're trying to build.
Absolutely, man. I mean, again, use those other businesses as like analogous to yours as examples, right? But then you have to figure out in this present moment, what wave can I ride and do something similar, but not exactly the same? Because if we had tried to build the Morning Brew, we wouldn't have been able to at that time, right? Like, I don't think people could build the Morning Brew again just because of how expensive ad dollars are and like how saturated the newsletter space is. So it's got to be a new arena, and then you can use that business as a corollary, and then that business might become the ideal acquirer. So that's kind of how we thought about things. And the business we always admired the most became the business that bought us, and now we get to work for them and continue to build this business underneath. So really a full circle story, and one that I'm very proud of, and one that gives me a lot of confidence and excitement for the future of what you and I can both do with our careers, and one that I think more young people I hope can learn from.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many other things we can touch on. I mean, like we only have so much time here, but if you have any specific questions or are curious about like very specific topics, we're happy to make a part 2 to this video. So let us know in the comments. Hit us on our socials. I think our info should be in the show notes per usual, but we want to be a resource to all of you guys trying to build your companies and want to add value to you. So yeah, I mean, we're open books. Ask us whatever.
Yeah, and thank you to those of you who've added comments and have watched these videos. Like, we're super grateful for your support. It's humbling that we have pretty much anybody watching us, to be honest. So thank you for everything, and we'll make sure to keep liking and responding to comments. But yeah, specific questions we'd love, and any ways that we can help and provide a piece of advice. I think we owe it to the next generation as Gen Z entrepreneurs. So thank you, everybody. Make sure to be subscribed and continue to watch the content. We're continuing to put out these episodes and continuing to study amazing founders. So this was a fresh change, and hope you guys enjoyed. As always, stay frosty, and me and the boy will be with you soon.
Stay frosty.